The phone slammed against the polished mahogany desk with a force that made the glass tremble. Richard Hale leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, eyes darting at the red numbers on his laptop screen. The stock prices were plummeting. Investors were panicking. Employees were whispering behind closed doors. And he, the man who had built Hale Tech from nothing, felt the ground falling out beneath him. "Another one," he barked, voice cutting across the office. His assistant flinched. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "3 more pullouts this morning. And the board is considering emergency measures." Richard slammed his palm against the desk, his knuckles whitening. "Tell them there are no measures. Not yet. Not until I decide." He rose, pacing the room, the leather of his shoes squeaking faintly on the floor. Something was off, not the numbers, they were expected, but a nagging unease he couldn't shake. He had gone to bed late the night before, haunted by a dream so vivid it lingered even now. In it, a massive ship, gleaming and proud, struggled against a storm that swallowed everything around it. Waves rose like mountains. Wind howled like a living thing. On the deck, men shouted and scrambled, trying desperately to keep control. Then he saw the boy. A small, fragile boy on a tiny boat, bobbing atop the waves, smiling at him as if he knew something he didn't. The boy waved. That simple gesture burned into his memory, leaving him restless, cold, and unmoored. Richard shook his head, trying to focus on the here and now. "It's just a dream," he muttered, though the unease remained. He rubbed his temples, staring at the numbers again. Hale Tech was teetering on the edge, and no amount of reassurance from analysts or board members would change that. The empire he had spent decades building was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it, unless he could figure out what the dream meant. By mid-morning, he had made a decision. Forget advisors. Forget consultants. He needed answers where logic couldn't reach. He left the sleek skyscraper office, ignoring the protests of his staff. The streets outside were crowded, noisy, chaotic, worlds apart from the sterile luxury of his office. He had never ventured this far into the city, preferring to stay in his bubble of power and control. But desperation drove him forward, and he followed an impulse he didn't fully understand. Hours passed as he wandered through alleys and side streets. Past crumbling buildings and bustling marketplaces. Vendors shouted over each other, children ran past selling trinkets, and the smell of food mingled with dust and exhaust. Richard felt absurd, out of place, exposed, vulnerable, but he didn't stop. He kept thinking about the boy, about the smile, about the tiny boat that had somehow seemed to hold the key to everything. Eventually, he found himself in a narrow alley where children played with handmade toys, their laughter cutting through the chaos. And there he saw him, a boy of 12, sitting cross-legged on the ground, tying colorful strings to his kites. His eyes were bright, intelligent, and fixed on something far beyond the alley. Something in the boy's gaze made Richard pause. "Excuse me," Richard said, his voice uncertain but firm. I need your help." The boy looked up, eyebrows raised. "Help? With what?" Richard swallowed, feeling a weight of embarrassment he hadn't felt in years. "I had a dream," he said. "A ship. A storm. And you. You were on a tiny boat. Smiling at me. Do you know what it means?" The boy studied him, then tilted his head, a small smile forming. "You're asking a 12-year-old about a dream," he said, voice curious, not mocking. "Most people would laugh." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling over. "I don't care if they laugh. My company is dying. I don't know what to do. I need to understand this dream." The boy's eyes softened, and he patted the notebook beside him. "Then maybe I can help," he said simply. He opened the worn pages, revealing sketches, diagrams, and scribbles of inventions and plans. You're building your ship too heavy, he said. Too many things pulling it down. You can't control the storm, but you can fix the leaks. Richard frowned, trying to make sense of it. Fix the leaks, he asked. Yes, the boy said firmly. Look at what you're holding on to. Projects that don't matter. People who slow things down. You can't control the storm of the market, the economy, or your competitors. But you can fix the things you've put in your ship. Cut the weight. Simplify. Focus on what keeps you afloat. For a long moment, Richard just stared. It sounded almost foolish. A boy selling kites in a slum telling a billionaire CEO how to save his company. And yet, there was a clarity in his words that no consultant had ever given him, no board meeting had revealed. His mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't considered, seeing patterns in chaos. Do you think it will work? He asked, almost whispering. I don't know, the boy said honestly. But it's better than doing nothing. And doing nothing will sink your ship for sure. Richard nodded slowly, feeling a spark of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. He stood, offering a hand. Thank you. I don't even know your name. Eli, the boy said. Just Eli. Richard left, clutching the boy's words in his mind, feeling the first flicker of determination in days. If he was going to save Hale Tech, he would start tonight, and he would do it his way. Back in his office, he sat down at his desk with renewed focus. He pulled up the company's operations reports, isolating the departments that were bleeding money. He looked at the countless projects running simultaneously and realized he had lost track of what mattered most. He called in his top executives. We're cutting everything that doesn't generate value immediately, he announced, voice sharp and unwavering. I don't want excuses. Focus on the products and services that define this company. Everything else can wait, or go. Understood. Yes, sir, the CFO said, hesitant but nodding. Richard leaned back, closing his eyes. He pictured the boy on the tiny boat, still smiling through the storm. If the boy could stay calm, so could he. He would ride the waves, fix the leaks, and rebuild. Hale Tech might be teetering now, but it was not yet lost. Hours turned into days. Richard worked tirelessly. Making tough decisions, canceling projects, restructuring teams. Some employees resisted, some quit. Investors were skeptical. Media headlines mocked his reckless simplification. Every move felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. And yet, the seed the boy had planted, a spark of clarity, of focus, of courage, kept him going. For the first time in weeks, he slept without nightmares. Not because the storm had ended, but because he finally felt he was steering the ship instead of letting it sink. Days passed, and Richard's office became a war room. The walls of glass reflected the city outside, but inside, tension simmered like a storm ready to explode. Charts, graphs, and spreadsheets littered every surface. Phones rang constantly. He barely slept, but he couldn't stop. Every decision now could mean survival, or the end. His assistant knocked nervously at the door. Sir, the board wants an emergency meeting tomorrow morning, she said, voice tight. They're worried about the cutbacks and the sudden changes. Richard didn't flinch. Let them worry. I've seen the leaks. I know what's sinking this ship. We fix the leaks first, and then we ride out the storm. Nothing else matters. Later that night, he reviewed financial reports again. He saw departments hemorrhaging money, products failing to deliver returns, and teams working at cross purposes. The weight of it was staggering. A knock interrupted his thoughts. It was his CFO, Paul, looking weary. Richard, you're making waves, Paul said carefully. Investors are furious. The media is spinning this as reckless. Some departments are on the brink of revolt. Richard's eyes burned. And what do you propose? That we sit and do nothing while everything collapses. That we cling to tradition because it's safe. Paul hesitated. No, but you're moving too fast. People need guidance. They need reassurance. Richard leaned forward, voice low but fierce. They will get guidance when the ship stops sinking. For now, we cut, we focus, we survive. I don't care if they hate me for it. Days turned into a week, and the board's tension reached a boiling point. One morning, Richard faced a panel of investors, all sitting in pristine suits, their expressions sharp with doubt. Mr. Hale, one began, your recent restructuring has shocked the market. Our confidence is shaken. Do you really believe your plan will save the company? Richard met his gaze, unwavering. Yes. I see the leaks, and I know where the ship will break if we don't act. We simplify. We focus. We survive. Another investor leaned forward. You're gambling with millions of dollars, Mr. Hale. This could ruin everything. I'd rather risk survival than accept slow death, Richard said, his tone cold, measured. The storm isn't waiting for us to be ready. Either we move, or we sink. The room went silent. No one spoke, but the tension was palpable. Some exchanged skeptical glances. Others seemed to absorb the raw determination in his voice. The CEO had never been so visibly unyielding, and it unsettled everyone around him. That night, Richard returned to his office, exhaustion weighing on him like lead. He stared at the city skyline, remembering Eli, the boy on the tiny boat. Somehow, that simple vision kept him steady. If a child could smile through a storm, he could do the same. A week later, the first signs of progress began. Employees who had resisted the cuts and changes started to see results. Projects that truly mattered began generating returns. Slowly, confidence returned to small corners of the company. But every victory was shadowed by the lingering fear of collapse. One evening, he called his top team together. We're not safe yet, he said, pacing the room. But we're moving in the right direction. Every decision counts. Every leak we fix brings us closer to surviving the storm. An intern spoke up timidly. Sir, how did you know what to do? None of us could see the solution like you did. Richard smiled faintly, thinking of Eli. Sometimes, wisdom comes from unexpected places. Sometimes, it comes from seeing what others ignore. The following days were filled with battles, each more intense than the last. Employees questioned his choices. Vendors hesitated. Competitors tried to exploit weaknesses. And the media had a field day, spinning his strategies as reckless gambles, calling the CEO a man clinging to hope rather than reality. Richard felt the pressure crush him, yet he pushed on. He would not allow fear to dictate decisions. Every night, he worked late, reviewing operations, talking to department heads, demanding accountability, and finding solutions. Each call, each meeting, was a test of endurance, of courage, and of clarity. One particularly stressful day, his assistant brought urgent news. Sir, another major investor just pulled out. They're threatening legal action unless changes are reversed. Richard slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing in the empty office. Then we survive without them. If they can't see the solution, it's their loss. We'll fix the leaks anyway. Hours later, he stood on the balcony, overlooking the glittering city. The wind whipped around him, carrying a chill that matched the tension in his bones. He thought again of Eli, the boy on the tiny boat, smiling calmly in the chaos. That vision anchored him. It reminded him that storms could not be controlled, but preparation, focus, and courage could make the difference between sinking and sailing. Richard's strategy slowly began to take hold. Teams realigned, inefficiencies vanished, and projects began yielding results. The first positive headlines appeared in the media, though skepticism lingered. Employees whispered cautiously, some with hope, some still in fear. One evening, exhausted, Richard stayed behind in his office, reviewing progress. Paul entered, holding a cup of coffee. "You're relentless," Paul said, voice low. "I don't know how you keep going. Everyone else would have folded weeks ago." Richard leaned back, exhausted but resolute. "I've seen the leaks, Paul. I've seen the ship sinking. And I can't let it happen. Not now. Not ever." Paul shook his head, impressed despite himself. "And the boy, the one you mentioned before? Eli?" Richard nodded. "He opened my eyes. Sometimes, wisdom comes from the most unexpected places." Paul chuckled softly. "Well, I hope you're right. Because if you're not, this ship goes down with all of us." Richard didn't answer. He only stared at the numbers, the charts, and the slow, steady signs of recovery, feeling a cautious hope begin to take root. By the end of the second week, small victories had accumulated into momentum. The board, initially furious, began to nod along during meetings. Employees who had been skeptical started to see Richard's vision clearly. And though investors remained anxious, the company was no longer teetering on the edge, it was beginning to right itself. Richard allowed himself a rare smile. He had faced the storm, and he was learning how to navigate it, one leak at a time. And in the quiet moments, he thought of Eli, the boy who had reminded him that courage, clarity, and focus could transform even the most desperate situation. Richard woke to the piercing sound of his phone at 4 a.m., the city still dark and quiet outside. He groaned, reaching for it, expecting another disaster report. But this time, it was an urgent message from the board. A new competitor had made a bold move, taking advantage of the company's temporary instability. He rubbed his eyes, heart pounding. The storm was far from over. "Damn it," he muttered. He knew every decision from here would be a test of endurance. Every misstep could cost him the company, maybe everything he had built. By sunrise, he was back in the office, moving like a man possessed. Charts, emails, reports, he combed through them all, looking for weaknesses in the structure he had rebuilt. The tension in the office was palpable. Employees whispered in corners, unsure whether hope was real or just another illusion. His CFO, Paul, approached cautiously, holding a stack of reports. "Richard, we've got media coverage again," he said. "They're calling your methods reckless. Investors are worried this is the beginning of the end." Richard slammed the reports down. "Then let them worry. This ship has been sinking for months. Now, we patch the leaks. And we sail." The following day, the board convened again. Richard entered the room, his suit crisp, his demeanor calm but unyielding. The room buzzed with tension, the air thick with doubt. "Mr. Hale," one investor began, eyes sharp, "your recent moves have shocked the market. Simplifying operations, laying off staff, canceling projects, you're risking the entire company." Richard leaned forward, gaze unwavering. "I'm not risking the company. I'm saving it. We can't control the storm, markets, competition, external pressures, but we can control the leaks we put in our own ship. Every cut, every focus, every adjustment keeps us afloat." A woman on the board scoffed. "You sound confident, but confidence doesn't pay bills. Do you truly believe this will work?" "I know it will," Richard said quietly, almost to himself. "Because doing nothing is not an option. We act. We adapt. We survive." The room fell silent. Some investors exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to admire his resolve or fear his recklessness. The tension was suffocating, but Richard had learned to thrive under it. Over the next week, the pressure intensified. Competitors tried to exploit the company's perceived weakness. Suppliers hesitated. Rumors swirled in the press. Every move Richard made was scrutinized. And yet, he persisted, fueled by the memory of Eli, the boy who had seen clarity in a simple truth. Late one night, Richard called a meeting with his department heads. Exhaustion etched into every face, they gathered reluctantly. "We're not out of the storm yet," Richard began, pacing. "But we are moving in the right direction. I need every one of you to focus on what matters. Every inefficiency, every distraction, every project that doesn't serve our core goals, eliminate it. Focus. Precision. Execution. That is how we survive." An assistant raised her hand, hesitation in her voice. "Sir, some teams are struggling. Morale is low. People are scared." Richard stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "I know. Fear is natural. But fear cannot paralyze us. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward despite it. I ask you to lead by example. Show your teams that we will not sink. That we will fix the leaks. That we will survive." Over the next few days, the results began to show. Small wins accumulated, a product that had been underperforming exceeded expectations. A restructured team doubled output. Confidence began to return, just a flicker at first, but enough to give momentum. Richard allowed himself a brief moment of pride, but he knew the real test had not yet come. The storm wasn't over, and he was still navigating treacherous waters. Every decision could undo the progress he had fought so hard to achieve. One evening, Paul entered, concern etched on his face. "Richard, there's more news. A major investor is threatening to withdraw unless we reverse some of the recent changes. They're saying your plan is too radical, too fast." Richard didn't flinch. "Then they don't understand the problem. This ship has been leaking for months. Waiting for approval, waiting for consensus, waiting for comfort, that is what sinks ships. We act. We fix the leaks. They can get on board or step aside." Paul shook his head. "You're relentless. I don't know if I've ever seen anyone like you." Richard allowed a small, tired smile. "Sometimes, you have no choice but to be relentless. Sometimes, it takes the vision of a child to remind you what's important." As the week drew on, Hale Tech began to stabilize. Headlines shifted cautiously, "Hale Tech shows signs of recovery." Employees whispered hope in corridors once filled with doubt. Investors watched nervously, unsure whether to applaud or anticipate another collapse. Richard's nights were still long, but he found focus in the chaos. He reviewed operations, guided his teams, and meticulously eliminated inefficiency. Every decision, every cut, every focus sharpened the company like a blade. Finally, after weeks of pressure, a turning point emerged. Revenue stabilized. Projects that mattered delivered results. Confidence began to ripple through the company. And in a quiet moment, Richard allowed himself to think of Eli again, the boy who had given him the vision, the clarity, and the courage to act. One evening, exhausted but resolute, Richard addressed his entire leadership team. "We're not out of the storm yet," he said, "but we are navigating it. Every decision you make, every effort you put in, brings us closer to surviving. We fix the leaks, we focus, we persist. And we will prevail." A young analyst spoke up, voice timid. "Sir, I've never seen anyone like you. How did you know this would work?" Richard smiled faintly. "I didn't. Not entirely. But sometimes, clarity comes from the most unexpected places. And when it does, you act." By the end of the third week, Hale Tech had begun its true turnaround. The first small victories had compounded, giving the company momentum. Employees were cautiously optimistic. Investors began to reconsider their stance. And Richard, once desperate, now felt the first real glimmer of hope in months. Late that night, he stood on the balcony of his office, looking over the city skyline. The wind bit at his face, a reminder of the storm outside. He closed his eyes and pictured Eli on the tiny boat, smiling amid chaos. The memory anchored him, reminding him that fear could not dictate action. Courage, clarity, and determination could. Richard allowed himself a moment of reflection. The boy's wisdom had not just saved a company, it had reminded him of what leadership truly meant. That even in desperation, even in fear, there was a way forward for those bold enough to act. The following weeks tested Richard like never before. Every day brought new challenges, competitors launching aggressive campaigns, media speculation reaching a frenzy, and investors scrutinizing every move. Yet, for the first time, Richard faced each challenge with quiet confidence. The lessons from Eli, the clarity of simplicity, the courage to act, the focus on what truly mattered, had become his compass. One morning, a major investor requested a private meeting. Richard entered, calm but alert, knowing that this could either solidify Hale Tech's future or shatter it completely. "Mr. Hale," the investor began, voice measured but tense, "we've been watching your recent changes. To be honest, we were skeptical, but the results are undeniable. Hale Tech is stabilizing. Revenues are improving. Your decisions, they seem to be working." Richard allowed a small smile. "Thank you. It wasn't easy. Every cut, every focus, every adjustment mattered. But we knew what had to be done." The investor leaned back, studying him. "Your persistence is remarkable. You risked a lot. Many would have folded under the pressure." "I didn't risk anything," Richard said quietly. "I didn't risk anything," Richard said quietly. "I acted. Doing nothing would have been the real risk." By midday, news outlets began to report the turnaround. Headlines cautiously praised the CEO's bold strategies. Employees whispered in hallways with cautious optimism, a far cry from the panic that had gripped them weeks earlier. Hale Tech was no longer sinking, it was righting itself, slowly but surely. Despite the relief, Richard knew he couldn't have done it alone. Eli's words had guided him when logic and experience failed. The boy's vision of the tiny boat in the storm had been a metaphor for the clarity and courage he needed. He returned to the slum district, walking the same narrow alleys he had traversed before, searching for Eli. Hours later, he found him, still sitting on the ground, tying colorful strings to handmade kites. The boy looked up, eyes wide in recognition, a smile spreading across his face. "Eli," Richard said, kneeling beside him, "you saved more than a company. I want to help you. Education, mentorship, resources, anything you need to grow, to dream, to create. You deserve it." Eli's eyes glistened. I just saw the leaks, sir. I didn't know it would help so much." Richard smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, the simplest wisdom changes everything. You reminded me to focus, to act, and to lead with courage. You've changed my life, Eli. Now, let me help change yours." Weeks later, Hale Tech had fully regained its stability. Projects that had been on the brink of collapse were now thriving. Confidence flowed through every department. Investors regained trust. Employees celebrated achievements once thought impossible. And at the heart of it all, Richard felt the satisfaction of having weathered the storm, not alone, but guided by the vision of a boy most would have overlooked. Sitting in his office one evening, Richard gazed out at the city skyline. The wind whispered through the skyscrapers, but inside, he felt a deep, calm resolve. The storm had passed, and Hale Tech was stronger for it. But more than that, he had learned a lesson he would carry forever: brilliance, courage, and insight could come from the most unexpected places, and leadership often meant listening when others might not. Richard turned back to his team. "We've survived, yes, but survival is just the beginning. Excellence requires vision, focus, and courage every single day. Never forget that." A junior analyst, emboldened, asked, "Sir, what about the boy? Will he be okay?" Richard smiled, thinking of Eli, now receiving support, opportunities, and mentorship. He will be more than okay. He'll be extraordinary. And he's a reminder that sometimes, hope comes from those we least expect. As the sun set, Richard allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The company had been saved. Employees were thriving. Investors were reassured. And the boy who had sparked clarity in the darkest moment had shown that courage and wisdom need no titles or wealth, just insight and a willingness to act. Richard rose, looking toward the future. He knew storms would come again, but he was ready. He had learned to navigate chaos, to find clarity in uncertainty, and to act decisively, no matter the fear. And most importantly, he had learned that sometimes, salvation comes from a single, unexpected voice, if you only have the courage to listen. Before the story closes, a small note from Richard: if this story inspired you, give it a like, share it with someone who needs hope, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that show courage and wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. Comment below with your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Richard's shoes? As the screen fades to black, the image of Eli, smiling on his tiny boat amidst the storm, lingers, an enduring symbol that even in chaos, clarity and courage can guide you through.